Touch the line right below your right wrist, not the one that divides the palm of your hand from the rest of your skin, the one further down, the one that looks like the very border between the hand and the arm. It is there right now as you listen to this. Maybe you have one, maybe you have two, some have three, thin as threads, or a single one that crosses the entire circumference of the wrist without interruption. In classical chiromantic nomenclature, that line is called the rasceta, a word that comes from medieval Latin rasceta, which in turn comes from Arabic, because it was in the medieval Arabic world where the tradition of reading that specific line reached its most complete systematization. And not as a simple anatomical fold, not as skin that bends when you move the joint, but as a text inscribed on the body that describes something about the soul inhabiting it. That is an ancient claim, very ancient. And for centuries it was transmitted in systems of knowledge that the Church declared heretical, that empires erased from their libraries, that time buried in the desert. But not all texts were destroyed. In recent years, a specific claim has circulated with increasing intensity, one that does not appeal vaguely to ancient tradition or the sages of antiquity, one that cites a concrete document with a name, with a documented history, with scholarly editions available in universities all over the world. The claim says that the Apocryphon of John states that this line on the wrist, the rasceta, appears on souls that do not belong to this world. This afternoon we are going to do something that this text implicitly asks us to do. Read it. Not the version circulating on social media, not the summary someone made of the summary someone else made. The text itself, its own words, its own cosmology, its own answer to the question that has been open since the 2nd century of our era, because the Apocryphon of John says extraordinary things, things that do not appear in any canonical Bible, things about how the human body was created, who created it, and why some beings inside that body feel for as long as they can remember that something here does not add up. That the rules of this world were written by someone whose intentions are not necessarily their own, that there is something inside them that is older than their body, that comes from somewhere else. If you pay attention, you will see that the history of that line on your wrist and the history of that ancient text meet at a point that no catechism mentions. Let us begin with the text. In December 1945, a peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was working at the foothills of a limestone cliff near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. He was looking for sabak, a fertile soil that Nile farmers used as fertilizer. His mattock struck something hard. Sealed inside a red clay jar, he found 13 papyrus codices, books bound in leather, written in Coptic, the last written stage of the ancient Egyptian language. Muhammad Ali did not know what he had in his hands. His mother burned some of the papyri to stoke the oven fire. But enough survived. What Muhammad Ali had found were 52 religious texts, texts that had been copied around the 4th century after Christ, but whose ideas date back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. Texts that the nascent church had declared heretical, which it had ordered to be destroyed, which a group, possibly monks from the monastery of St. Pachomius, had carefully sealed before destruction arrived. The Nag Hammadi Library. Among the texts it contained, one stands out for the scope of its cosmological vision and for the complexity of its theological architecture. It is called the Apocryphon of John, also known as the Secret Book of John, or in more recent scholarly translations, the Revelation of John. In the Nag Hammadi codices, it appears in 4 distinct versions, 2 long versions in Codex 2 and Codex 4, and 2 short versions in Codex 3 and in the Berlin manuscript known as Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. The fact that 4 copies existed indicates that it was a central text within Gnostic communities, a text that was studied, copied, and taught. But it was not discovered for the first time in 1945. Irenaeus of Lyons, the Christian bishop who wrote his monumental work against heresies around the year 180 of our era, already described the content of this text. He mentioned it with alarm. He quoted it extensively to refute it, and without knowing it, by doing so, he preserved it. Thanks to Irenaeus, we know that the Apocryphon of John existed and circulated at least since the 2nd century, that it was influential enough for the bishop of one of the most important churches in the Roman Empire to dedicate entire pages to combating it. What did that text say that caused so much fear? The Apocryphon of John begins with a disturbing scene. The Apostle John, brother of James, has just left the temple in Jerusalem. He has met a Pharisee named Aramanios, who asks him in a contemptuous tone, "Where does that master you followed lead you? Do you not see that he deceived you with lies and closed your heart?" John walks away. He withdraws to the mountain deeply disturbed. And then something happens. A vision, a presence that changes shape. Sometimes that of an old man, sometimes that of a young man, sometimes that of a child. And that presence says to him, "John, why do you doubt? Why do you fear? I am the one who is with you always. I am the Father. I am the Mother. I am the Son." This opening is already extraordinary. A triune presence that is not the God of the Old Testament. That is not simply the resurrected Jesus. It is something that contains all those forms and transcends them. What follows is a cosmological revelation of a density that has no parallel in the Gospels we know. The text first describes what exists before material creation, the invisible one, immeasurable, ineffable. The text says, in the scholarly translation by the scholar Frederick Wyss, who worked with the Nag Hammadi manuscripts for decades, that the one cannot be perceived by any created mind, that it has no beginning, it has no end, that it is perfect in its light, but that this light is not the light we know, that all we can say about it is that it is, and that from it, in a process the text calls the thought of itself, emerges the first being distinct from the one. That being is called Barbello, the first power, the invisible mother, the providence of the all, the thought of the Father that becomes an entity. From the one proceeds Barbello, and from Barbello and the one proceed other emanations of light, a universe of light and mind that the Gnostics called the fullness, the pleroma, a cosmos that exists before matter exists, before time, space, and death exist. And then something goes wrong. Within the pleroma, there exists a being called Sophia, wisdom in Greek. Sophia desires to create on her own, without the balance of the Spirit, without the approval of the One. She acts from her own unsubmitted will, and what she begets is not light, it is an imperfect being. The text describes it with words that have no equivalent in any conventional theology. His name is Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth, also called the demiurge, the artisan of the world, the creator, is the being who, in the cosmological system of the Apocryphon of John, creates the material universe, and he creates it in his own image, ignorant. Yaldabaoth does not know that anything superior to him exists. The text shows him declaring, with a phrase that echoes disturbingly with the book of Exodus, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God besides me." For those who wrote the Apocryphon of John, that statement was not an expression of divine greatness. It was evidence of limitation. A truly omniscient being does not need to assert that there is no other God besides him. The very need to make that declaration reveals that something in him suspects there is something beyond, that there is something that transcends him and that he cannot see. And he is right. Yaldabaoth creates the archons. In the long version of the text, there are 12 principal powers, 12 rulers of the material cosmos. He assigns them to the spheres, to the elements, to the domains of the sensible world. And together, Yaldabaoth and his archons build the world we know, the world of matter, temporality, corruption, death. And then, and here we come to the center of what matters to us this afternoon, they create the human being. The Apocryphon of John describes this process with a precision that scholars who studied it starting in the second half of the 20th century found equal parts disturbing and fascinating. Yaldabaoth receives an image of light that descends from the heights of the pleroma, which is reflected in the waters of chaos, and which he sees without understanding where it comes from. Sophia, who now dwells on the border between the pleroma and the material world, is the one who shows that image. And Yaldabaoth says, using a phrase that any reader of Genesis will recognize immediately, "Let us make a human being according to the image of God and according to our likeness." The Apocryphon of John takes that phrase, the one that has always generated the question of who that "let us make" refers to, and answers it with a clarity that Orthodox theology never allowed itself. The "let us make" are the archons, and the image according to which they create the human is not their own. It is the image of the one that was reflected from the pleroma, and that Yaldabaoth saw in the water without understanding what he was looking at. The archons build a body. The long version of the text, the one from Nag Hammadi Codex II, lists 365 of them in this section, one for each day of the solar year. Each one is responsible for a part of the human body. The text lists them by name. There are archons responsible for the bones, for the tendons, for the blood, for the internal organs, for the nerves, for the skin, and there are archons responsible for specific areas, for joints, for folds, for the borders between one part of the body and another. Stop here for a moment. 365 beings who designed the human body part by part, like architects, like engineers of a machine. And their work was not created out of love or genuine creative intent. It was created in ignorance to trap something that did not belong to them, because the body the archons built was empty, without movement, without real life. It was an uninhabited form, and then something happened that changed the destiny of the entire cosmos. From the one came a breath, a fragment of the light that dwelt in the heights of the pleroma. In some versions of the text, it is Sophia who, regretting what she originated, asks the one to rescue the spark that was left exposed in Yaldabaoth's work, and the one sends that spark downward. It enters the body, and suddenly the creature moves. The archons, the text says, were filled with fear when they saw that the being they had built stood up, that it spoke, that it thought, that it had something in it that they had never had and could not manufacture, a spark of the pleroma, a fragment of the one. And from that moment, the history of the cosmos in the Gnostic system of the Apocryphon of John is the history of that spark trying to remember what it is. Before continuing, I need to tell you something directly. Bringing this kind of content, texts that were buried for 2,000 years, scholarly analysis that rarely reaches Spanish-speaking audiences, ideas that historical power systems tried to erase, comes with a cost that YouTube does not cover. They removed our monetization a long time ago. They keep placing ads on our videos. We do not see that money. That is why the pneumatic code exists, not as a commercial product, as a way to keep this information alive without depending on a system that actively works against us. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Only available while this video is active. The pneumatic code. Just like the souls that the Apocryphon of John calls pneumatic carry within them a spark that no archon in any of the versions of the text managed to extinguish. Let us return to the text. The Apocryphon of John describes 3 categories of souls that inhabit the material world. This classification is one of the most original contributions of Gnostic cosmology, and it has been analyzed extensively by the scholar Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, who dedicated decades to the study of the Nag Hammadi texts, and by Bentley Leighton of Yale University, whose critical edition of the Gnostic texts became a standard reference. The first category is the hylix, from the Greek hyle, which means matter. They are the beings in whom the spark of the pleroma did not manage to ignite in an active way. They live entirely within the logic of the material world, its desires, its fears, its values, its sense of time. The text does not condemn them. It does not describe them as inferior in dignity. It describes them as part of the world that Yaldabaoth created, completely integrated into it. The second category is the psychics. From the Greek psyche, soul, they have an inner dimension that the hylix do not have to the same extent, a capacity for questioning, for searching, for something that transcends the merely material. But they remain tied, according to the text, to the structure of the demiurge. Their souls belong to the domain of Yaldabaoth, even though they may aspire to something beyond him. The third category is the one the text develops in greatest detail, and it is the one that matters for understanding the question that brought us here. They are the pneumatics. From the Greek pneuma, spirit. They are those in whom the spark of the pleroma is active, not simply present, active, awake. The Apocryphon of John says that these beings carry within them the very substance of the primordial light, that their real origin is not this world, that they arrived here, were trapped here, but they carry a memory of origin that no archon can completely erase. The long version of the text includes at the end a section that scholars have called the Hymn of Pronoia. It is perhaps the most beautiful text in the entire Nag Hammadi library. Pronoia, which is the providence of the One, the presence that descends into the material world to search for those who can be awakened, speaks in the first person. And she says, I am the Pronoia of the pure light. I am the thought of the virginal spirit who raises you to the honored place. Arise and remember that it is you who have heard, and follow your root, which is I, the merciful one. Guard yourself against the depths of ignorance. Guard yourself against the prison of forgetfulness. Arise and remember. Those are the words of the text. Not look for a sign on your body, not look at your wrist, but arise and remember. The pneumatic does not recognize their origin because they have a physical mark on the surface of their skin. They recognize it because there is something in them that awakens when they hear the right words. A profound discomfort with this world that never found an adequate name, a memory of something they do not know how to call, a longing that no material satisfaction completely calms. And yet, there is a reason why that line on your wrist ended up associated with this text. And that reason is not arbitrary. To understand it, we have to talk about something that the Apocryphon of John does describe in detail, how the archons marked the human body. There is a passage in the long version of the text that scholars have called the list of bodily archons. As we mentioned before, the 365 archons did not just build the human body. Each one left their mark on the part they modeled. Each one inscribed something of their nature into the material they worked on. And this created, according to the cosmology of the text, a body that is literally a map of powers, a text written by its builders. Bentley Leighton, in his analysis of this section, points out that the enumeration of the archons and their corresponding body parts is not merely anecdotal. It has a function within the system of the text. It establishes that the human body is a work of multiple authorship, that each region of the body carries the signature of the archon who built it, and that, therefore, the body can be read. A text can be read. If the body is a text written by 365 archons, then it makes sense that those who know how to read it can extract information about the soul that inhabits it. And if the pneumatic spark is of a radically different origin than that of the archons, if it comes from the pleroma, then that difference should produce some kind of disruption in the text of the body. An anomaly. A mark indicating, here is something that was not planned. The text does not make that connection in those explicit terms, but the logic of its cosmology opens it up, and the traditions that followed filled it in. The Corpus Hermeticum, Greek philosophical religious writings of the 2nd and 3rd centuries that share with Gnosticism the conception of the soul trapped in matter, describes in the Poimandres a doctrine it calls the theory of imprints. When the divine nous descends into matter, it leaves imprints of its passage. The human body, the point where the light became densest, is where those imprints are most concentrated. And the threshold areas between one segment of the body and another are the places where that concentration is most visible. The wrist is exactly that kind of threshold, the point where the hand ends and the arm begins, where the limb that acts upon the world joins with the body that carries it. In the Hermetic tradition, thresholds are the places where that which is above and that which is below have their most accessible point of communication. The traditions of chiromancy that developed in Persia, India, and the medieval Arabic world independently arrived at a classification of the rasceta that remarkably coincides with the tripartite classification of the Apocryphon of John. A single line indicated a soul integrated into the logic of the material world. Two lines indicated the split soul, the being who lives between two worlds, who never feels completely at home in either. Three lines, especially when the first crossed the entire wrist without interruption, was the sign of the being who not only comes from a different origin, but at some level remembers that origin and carries it as both a burden and a gift at the same time. Do you see how these two traditions, with no record of having read each other, describe the same category? The Apocryphon of John speaks of three types of souls. Medieval Arabic chiromancy speaks of three types of rasceta, and both systems end up describing the same thing in the third type, the being who carries something that does not add up in this world. How these traditions merged into the claims circulating today is a story with its own mystery. The text does not say that in those exact terms, but there is a traceable path from its cosmology to that conclusion. There is something else that the Apocryphon of John says, and which is rarely mentioned when speaking of this cosmology. The text describes what it calls the myth of forgetfulness. When the pneumatic spark becomes trapped in the body that the archons built, it does not simply remain trapped, it falls asleep. An archon introduces forgetfulness into the soul, not the forgetfulness of dreams, the fundamental forgetfulness. The soul that entered carrying the memory of its origin begins to believe that this world is all that exists. The Gnostics had a word for that state, agnoia, ignorance, not the ignorance of not knowing a fact, the ignorance of not remembering what you are. And the purpose of the Apocryphon of John is exactly that, to awaken that memory, not to teach you something new, to remind you of something you already know. Elaine Pagels describes the Gnostic project as a project of anamnesis, recovery of lost memory. And she points out something crucial. The experience described in the text is real for many people. There are human beings who feel from childhood that this world is not their home, a persistent intuition that something here does not add up, that there is something inside them older than their body. The Apocryphon of John calls that experience the testimony of the pneumatic spark. And it says that when the pneumatic soul hears the words of gnosis, it recognizes them. It does not learn them, it recognizes them. Like when you hear a song you had forgotten and feel you always knew it. Gnosis. In Greek, knowledge, but not accumulated knowledge. The knowledge the soul has of its own origin when that origin is revealed to it. Not because someone explains it, because something inside it remembers it. The Apocryphon of John does not present gnosis as something that is taught. It presents it as something that is recovered. And those conditions of recovery can be many: a text, a moment of silence, an encounter with a certain idea, or perhaps a mark on the body that acts as an anchor for that process. A threshold where the pneumatic spark is most visible. The tradition after Nag Hammadi picked up this idea and developed it. The Hermetic texts of the European Renaissance, those of the Christian Kabbalah of the 16th century, those of the Rosicrucian tradition of the 17th century, all share a doctrine about the body of the initiate, the being who has begun to awaken, who has begun the process of anamnesis that the Apocryphon of John describes, carries visible marks of that process, not in the sense of medically verifiable physical changes, in the sense that the internal reorganization that occurs when the pneumatic soul begins to remember externalizes itself in some way in the text of the body. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa of Nettesheim, the 16th century Hermetic philosopher whose occult philosophy was one of the most influential texts of the Renaissance, describes the wrist as the point of the body where the will of the soul and the will of the body have their most visible negotiation. For Agrippa, whose work draws directly from Greek Hermetic texts, a pronounced rasceta was the sign of a soul that inhabits its body differently from others. Not better, not superior, different. A soul that did not completely settle into the material body because something in it recognizes that this body is not its permanent residence. a soul that, using the language of the Apocryphon of John, does not completely belong to this world. Before the final part of this video, there is something I want to tell you directly. What you found here this afternoon, in this text, in these ideas, in this conversation with a manuscript that survived 2,000 years of forgetfulness, is available beyond this video in the Pneumatic Code. It is the most complete work we have produced for those who feel that Gnostic cosmology, the Hermetic tradition, and the Nag Hammadi texts describe something real, something that is not learned but recognized. If what you heard here resonated with you, the link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Only available while this video is active. Just like the texts Muhammad Ali found in that clay jar in the desert, some things do not wait indefinitely to be taken. There is one final dimension of this text that needs to be told. The Apocryphon of John says that the archons fear pneumatic souls, not for their intelligence, not for their strength. They fear them because they carry within them something the archons cannot create, cannot copy, cannot destroy, the spark of the pleroma. And this is perhaps the deepest observation of the text's entire cosmology, the asymmetry between the builders and the built. Yaldabaoth and his archons can build bodies, they can build entire worlds, they can build systems of forgetfulness of extraordinary complexity, but they cannot create gnosis. They cannot manufacture the spark. They cannot replicate what comes from the One. The reason is simple within the logic of the text. To create something, you must first contain it within yourself. And the archons never had that spark. They only saw it reflected from afar in the waters of chaos without understanding what they were looking at. That is why they need to keep it trapped. A soul without that spark active can be completely managed within the system of the demiurge. It functions according to his rules, desires what the system offers, fears what the system threatens. But a pneumatic soul always has a point of resistance, a place where the logic of the material world simply does not apply. A place where it does not care what the system promises, nor what the system threatens, because at some level it knows that this system is neither its origin nor its destination. The text says that the archons attempted multiple strategies to suppress that spark. They constructed forgetfulness. They designed the body as a series of layers of distraction. They manufactured the material world as a system of attention absorption so sophisticated that the pneumatic soul rarely finds enough silence to remember, all so that it never remembers what it is. And yet the text also says that they failed, that the spark cannot be completely extinguished, that eventually, in this time or another, the voice of Pronoia arrives and says, "Arise and remember." The hymn of Pronoia, in the third and final descent of providence to the material world, describes that moment with an intimacy that has no equivalent in any text of antiquity that I have ever read. Pronoia speaks in the first person. She says, "I entered into the midst of the prison, which is the prison of the body, and I said, 'He who hears, let him awaken from the heavy sleep.' The man wept and shed bitter tears, and I said, 'Why do you call? From where comes your hope when you dwell in the depths of darkness?' I answered, 'I am the Pronoia of the pure light. I am the thought of the virginal spirit. Arise and remember. You follow your root, which is I. Guard yourself against the depths of ignorance. Guard yourself against the prison of forgetfulness. Arise and remember. Arise and remember." This phrase, which the text repeats twice in the final hymn, is the answer of the Apocryphon of John to its own dark cosmology. The world was created by ignorant beings. The body was built as a trap. The soul was plunged into forgetfulness. But the text does not end in tragedy. It ends with a voice that descends through that darkness and says, "You did not forget. You only slept. And I came to remind you that you can awaken." Karen King of Harvard points out something crucial so as not to misunderstand this text. Gnosticism is not nihilism. It does not say that the world is evil and must be abandoned. It says that it was made with limited intentions, but that within that world there is something that transcends those intentions. The question is not whether the material world is real. The question is whether it is all that exists. The answer of the text is no. And this is perhaps the deepest observation of the entire cosmology of the Apocryphon of John. the asymmetry between the builders and the built. Yaldabaoth and his archons can build bodies, worlds, systems of forgetfulness, but they cannot create gnosis. They cannot manufacture the spark. To create something, you must first contain it within yourself. And the archons never had that spark. They only saw it reflected in the waters of chaos without understanding what they looked at. That is why they need to keep it trapped. A soul without that spark can be completely managed within the system of the demiurge, but a pneumatic soul always has a point of resistance, a place where the logic of the material world simply does not apply. The text says that the archons failed, that the spark cannot be completely extinguished, that the voice of pronoia arrives and says, "Arise and remember." Now look down. If you have not done so already, touch that line below your right wrist. I am not asking you if you are pneumatic or psychic or hilic. Those categories are not diagnoses, and the Apocryphon of John does not present them as sealed destinies. Sophia herself, the one who originated the error that created Yaldabaoth, is not condemned in the text. Eventually she is restored to the pleroma. There is no one in the Gnostic system who is lost forever, only asleep in different degrees of depth. I am asking you something different. When you touch that line, is there something in you that moves? Not in the physical sense, in the sense that the Apocryphon of John would say is the only sense that matters. Is there something in you that, upon hearing all this, does not learn it? That recognizes it? If the answer is yes, then the text has already done what it came to do. It did not teach you anything. It reminded you of something you were carrying, something that the forgetfulness of the archons covered with decades of noise, of daily urgency, of borrowed certainties. And that something, this afternoon, stirred. And if the answer is no, if all this sounds like ancient speculation with no resonance in your experience, then perhaps that too is information. The Apocryphon of John does not say that everyone carries the pneumatic spark active. It says that some do, and that those will know who they are when they hear it. The text ends with John coming down from the mountain and sharing what he heard with his disciples. The Apocryphon of John says that they received it with joy, that they praised it, that they kept it in silence. And then it adds a phrase that translators have pointed out as one of the most enigmatic in the entire text. The Savior appeared to them at all times, not in a single revelation that is remembered. At all times, as if gnosis, once awakened, were never exhausted, as if the voice of pronoia that said arise and remember kept saying exactly that at every moment in which the soul is still enough to listen. The question that this text has left open since the 2nd century, which no council closed, which no bonfire extinguished, which no desert could definitively bury, is not, do you have a pronounced line below your right wrist? The question is simpler and deeper than that. The question is, do you remember?